Hi guys, I think we are ready, so let's start. Hi, I'm Tom. I'm one of the Android developers at Perform Group, and I currently work at on a sports streaming application called DAZN. And when we started our application a year and a half ago, we were asked to make sure that the application would be of the best quality one could get. And we also already started thinking about JUnit and unit testing in general, and also automated testing. We also knew that at that time, our product owner has already started writing some requirements, and he has used a language called Gherkin. So it was a no-brainer for us to start using Gherkin as a base for our automation. That's why I'd like to introduce you to the Gherkin language in theory today, go through a sample Gherkin test, show you how and where to use Gherkin, and also then I would like to focus on how Gherkin can be used with automation. But first of all, I would like to go through behavior-driven development, which is the most basic thing behind Gherkin. So I have a question to you. Could you tell me who here has written a unit test in their life? Please raise your hand. Okay, I think that's half of the room here. Who has heard of something like test-driven development? Yeah, I think that's also around half of the room here. So that's what I was expecting to see. And I'll be referring to test-driven development a few times here because it turns out that behavior-driven development is not so different from TDD. And the main difference is that the authors of BDD, behavior-driven development, have observed that you cannot really use test-driven development or unit testing to test entire functionalities. And this is because entire functionalities usually split on different layers of your code. And because of that, you would have to write lots of unit tests to test a single real-world scenario. And that's why the authors of BDD have defined a set of, let's say, requirements for a language that would be more suitable to testing entire functionalities with single scenarios. And this language should be, first of all, easy to use. It's assumed to be usable both for non-technical and technical people. It should also be, on the other hand, well-defined enough, at least, so that we can use the same language for stimulating, let's say, our automation tests. The language, because of the high level of it, should more focus on the problem we want to solve for the user, not the actual implementation. Because of that, we could even say that the language leaves the technology a bit on the side. As in TDD, one could expect that we start behavior-driven development process with defining the problem to solve. And then we also choose to check that it's not solved yet. In a more technical terms, you could say that we are writing a test that is failing. Then we go and implement it. We are not going to talk about that here at all. And the last thing is to execute the test we had before and check that it passes this time. So in other words, we are making sure that the problem is solved. The thing is that because it's an automated test, you can then execute that test whenever you want to check if your functionality is still working correctly. It turns out that Gherkin is that language that fulfills all the BDD requirements. It's of a very high level of abstraction. It's based on plain English. It assumes using of a domain-specific language. And it has 7 the most basic keywords that are available in it. So it's feature, scenario, given, when, then, and but. Sorry. So first of all, we have features that are split into scenarios. So features can be compared to test classes, and scenarios can be compared to test methods. Each of the test methods, in our case a scenario, will consist of 3 main sections, given when then. Those sections can contain single plain English sentences or multiple sentences joined with the and or but keyword. And the thing about that language is that it's supposed to be either readable and writable by anyone, by anybody connected to the project. There is no technical requirements, and the only project-related requirement is that the writing person or reading one has to know the domain-specific language. Other than that, you don't really need to know any platform SDKs, any frameworks that your developers might need to use. And also, one more thing worth noting is that it's going to be very high level, and it's going to focus on using on use cases and focus on solving problems for your users, not being too much technical at the same time. So as I said, there are 3 main sections in any Gherkin test. We have given, which is a set of our preconditions where we set our system state so that we can follow up with some events. Those events will be put in the then section. We are usually trying to make that section not so long, because there is already plenty of things going on in the given and then sections. And then we have the then section, which is supposed to assert that our outcome and the state and the resulting state of our system is as expected. And when reading or writing tests that have multiple things in common, you might also use a few of the niceties in the language. And the first one is backgrounds. This keyword can be used if you want to have a few tests that are starting with the same preconditions. You could compare the background keyword to setup or before in any JUnit, or generally in any unit testing framework. There is also the possibility to have more parameterized tests, and you can obtain that with scenario outlines. We also have the concept of tags. And tags can be used to classify different tests in whatever manner we really want to. So in our application, we decided to use tags, for example, to classify some tests that are problematic when being executed in our automation testing environment. The last thing is actors, and actors can be used to represent different kinds of users you have in your application. So, for example, you can have an actor that would be a representation of a user who has not paid for the subscription in your app. And at the same time, you can define another actor that would represent a user that has paid for your subscription. So, as in any other language, you might wonder, what are the requirements? What I need to start? And because of the few keywords required in the language, and the language being based on plain English, you don't really need anything. You can use whatever text editor you want. You can use some of the IDEs, because they will give you some additional stuff that might be helpful, but it's not required. The tests written in Gherkin should be put in a .feature file, but you don't really need to do that at the beginning. So you can start off with just putting your requirements in a Gherkin form in any, I don't know, Jira ticket or Redmine or whatever you really need and whatever works for you. So let's quickly go through a Gherkin sample so that we can see how it works in practice. Let's imagine we are going to write a simple Gherkin test that will check a regular sign-in functionality. And as you can put multiple scenarios in the same feature file, you usually would start with the feature keyword, after which you can put a textual representation of what is going to be tested with that feature. You can already see that there is a high-level language used here. It's plain English, and it's not really talking about the details. And then we can have multiple scenarios. Each scenario begins with a scenario keyword, and it also is followed by a plain English sentences that describe what's the scenario doing. Next, we are ready to give our steps or define our steps of the tests. And we begin with the given keyword. So as I mentioned, we just set up our state. Notice that we have a single sentence here. It says, I enter a login page. But it's because of it being very high level, it could end up in our real test, it could end up being, I don't know, entering the application, going through some landing page, and then clicking on a sign-in button. Then we have the when keyword, where we execute our actions. As I mentioned, we sometimes want to join multiple sentences in Gherkins, and that's why we have the end keyword for. And after that, we finally get to make our assertions in the test. So I think that it's also important to note here that all the steps are written as if the reader of the tests was the actual user of our system. And that's because we want somehow to put ourselves as the readers, put ourselves in the user's shoes. And in our project, we have defined 3 places where Gherkin comes really useful. And the first one, and the most, I think, obvious one, is using Gherkin in written requirements. Don't read that. It's just a simple comparison. So on the left-hand side or right-hand side of the slide, you can see how it looks like with when written in plain text. So there is a lot of complex sentences here, and it's hard to really follow the fact that there are 2 separate use cases here. And on the right or left-hand side, you can see how it looks in Gherkin. It adds some well-defined format, and it's much easier to read. And because Gherkin forces you to split different complex sentences by the use of the end keyword, you end up with splitting all the complex use cases. And I would even say that because of that, you are somehow decreasing the level of complexity of your tests and the level of nesting too. The other thing is that at some point, you or your QA team might like to assert or check whether all the functionalities are working properly still. So let's say you could do that before any release or before any major changes in your code. And at that point, a set of Gherkin tests can be really useful and can help you with making sure that nothing is broken and you can just follow up. It's pretty obvious here that it's not enough, and I don't think that Gherkin is supposed to be the language that will be used to write down all the functionalities you have very exactly. But it's a good starting point, and it won't let you just forget about the things that you have in your app. And the last thing is that the last appliance for Gherkin is mapping your Gherkin tests and executing them in some testing environment. And this seems to be the ultimate goal of Gherkin, at least from my point of view. And it's pretty obvious that at that point you wouldn't be really able to just execute all these Gherkin steps in your environment. That's why we usually have to use some framework that will take any of the Gherkin steps and execute some well-defined function in your language, development language on your platform. So you can see a sample mapped method here. So it begins with saying our framework that whenever you see I enter a valid username, then please execute that method. And after that, you can really do whatever you need to. As you can see, we are using Espresso here. On iOS, you'd probably use AirGlay or whatever you want. The thing is that this approach will let you have a well-defined set of scenarios on one hand side, but on the other hand side, you can still use whatever tools you want for assertions. And this, in fact, can lead to some multi-platform solutions or things like that. And right now, let's dig a little more into Gherkin and automation. And we have, over a year and a half of working with Gherkin, we have observed a few things that are worth mentioning. And the first thing is the page object solution we have worked out. So whenever we introduce a new view in our application or a huge functionality, we also introduce a new page object. And that page object is a set of tests that are then mapped to Gherkin. And because of that, that approach, whenever you are trying to see what are the available tests, I mean Gherkin steps, or what are the available things that you can extend on, are usually lying in a given page object. The other thing is that those frameworks that are mapping your Gherkin steps into some testing environment are usually doing that with the use of regular expressions. So you can alleviate regular expressions, and for example, as you can see in this slide, instead of the actual HTTP code, we are just using a regular expression, and the actual value is then passed to the method as a parameter. There are a couple of things that are also worth mentioning or worth considering, and I think it's important to note that in general, espresso and AirGlay tests are flaky. In our case, we have seen that every now and then there is a test that will fail, and it will fail for no apparent reason for us. And as I mentioned, we are using the @flaky annotation to mark those tests and retry the runs. But it's not the silver bullet here, and it's worth noting that whenever you see some issues with your tests, you would first have to go through the steps and through your code and make sure that you really understand what's going on in the frameworks, what's going on with the multi-processing you are doing, and so on. Or multi-threading, sorry. And we have also observed that accessibility turns out to be very useful in our tests. And I'm mostly talking about very complex views where it's hard to really go through the entire view and assert for the exact values. You can still use accessibility. You can still assign some tags to your custom views, even if you are drawing straight to a canvas. And as tests are Gherkin tests, and tests in general are usually assumed to be executed in isolation, there is some mocking you have to do. Let's now go through a few examples of mocking we have seen that are very useful. And first of all, I think that one cannot really overstate how much dependency injection and interface segmentation is useful when trying to mock. And when you use it properly, you end up with two variants of your application. One would be the production one, and the other would be a almost production one with some dependencies being mocked. There are a couple of things that we are mocking regularly. The first pretty obvious one is persistence mocking. You need to somehow clean up after the test you have just executed. You need to be ready for the next test to come and clean up after your current test. And also you somehow need to have steps like given I have not signed in or given I have signed in. The other thing to mock is HTTP backend mocking. And it's quite a regular thing. And I think that backends are designed to be changing. And the thing is that you can't really have the same results when your backend keeps changing. It's even worse when there is some flaky connection and so on. So at some point, you need to start mocking the entire HTTP responses. And for example, on Android, we have decided to use WireMock to do that. And that's because of its two large functionalities. The first one is that you can define what are the default values that are returned by your mock backend. And in our case, we decided to go with the positive path, and we decided that the positive path of the values returned by the backend will be the default one. And that's because we want to, in the future, when writing some next tests that are depending on the currently written ones, we want to have the ability to start our automation faster. And the other feature in WireMock is that you can still define some custom values that are somehow defined in your code. And that's how you can provide steps like given backend returns 404 when I sign in or something like that. And you will also see that some of the libraries will not be easy to assert on. Some of them will have accessibility issues, others will try to make sure that your content is really safe. We had such issues, for example, with our player, and generally when players are being used with DRM protection, they won't let you see what's on the player, what's being played, and so on. So we have alleviated one more time dependency injection and injected a slightly different variant of the player. And this one will simply allow you to see what's on the player, what's being played currently, and what's the position of it. So that's how you can get some steps like I can see live video playing running. And last but not least, we also see that sometimes we need to work on the unmockable parts of the SDK. So let's assume as a user, you'd like to go to settings and turn off location preferences for your app. And it turns out that it's really cumbersome, and it's pretty much impossible to do in the testing frameworks we have, UI testing frameworks we have right now. That's why we usually wrap those special SDK parts with some interfaces and provide some mocked versions of them whenever we need to. Obviously, we are also, whenever we introduce a new mock in the application, I mean the mocked application, then we also introduce a page object with it. And so that helps us with extending those mock objects whenever we come back to them later on. And when it comes to mocking, I think that it's kind of, you are kind of trying to find the sweet spot of it. And when you mock too much, you end up with application that will not, or a set of tests that will not break when you change your code and you break it. And when you mock too little, your tests will be flaky, and at some point you will see that the results are changing and you are not doing anything else. And I think it's in practice you could assume that you are writing your tests to fail every time your code changes, but you shouldn't be really looking for changes in your external libraries. So you've seen 3 different appliances of Gherkin, and I think that the most important thing is that you can still do that with a single Gherkin test. You can have the same set of tests being defined in your feature requirements. You can then move them to your manual requirements repository. And finally, you can put them in the .feature file in your repository of your automated test. And it can still work. And I think that if you have that, you are getting the most of Gherkin. And probably some of you might wonder, should I really use it? And I don't really have the answer for you. I must say that it takes a while to get used to that, and there are a few things that we have seen that might be problematic. It doesn't come from our experience only. I've also seen a few teams that were trying to use Gherkin or test automation in general, and that are the things that are the most obvious and the things that are most mentioned. So you need to take care of your test code quality, and if you let it go stale, or if the quality gets poor, then the test will be worse and worse. High flakiness, as I mentioned, if you let your test fail too many times and start ignoring that, it will also just not make too much sense. Too little tests is also problematic. If you have a few tests and you see things breaking, even though the tests are passing, you start losing the confidence about your tests, and at some point you wouldn't have to run the test because it doesn't really matter. Non-hermetical environments. I've showed you a few ways how to mock stuff around your application, and it seems to be the only way around. And there are also cases when quality is not being valued by you or your business team or whoever else connected to your project. And there are some legitimate reasons for that. For example, when working on short-living applications or things like that. And on the other hand, I think that if you consider having a long-running application, let's say a year or two or something like that, then it's also the amount of work that you put into Gherkins at some point will pay off, and you'll see that the tests will really fail and show you what you have just broken. And as the last point of that presentation, I'll just show you a few stats from our project. So it's been almost a year and a half since we started it, and it's not a huge team, but we still have managed to build a pretty impressive, at least for us, number of Gherkin tests, and we can see them failing. And sometimes when they fail, they really show us that there are some issues that we have introduced in the application. And we still have the entire build time below 30 minutes, and we are pretty proud to say that we are kind of almost always in the 100% crash-free users range. And I think that to sum up, I would say that because of the usage of Gherkins, we have learned how to talk to each other together with our business and different parts of people connected to the project. And also we have gained a new QA. That QA will probably miss a lot, and that QA won't pay attention to the details, but he will for sure be able to run the same tests 30 times a day, and he won't be just overwhelmed with it. So it's useful to have something like that.